A lot of changes were occurring in southern Texas during this time. And remember, southern Texas, the reason why we're focusing on that region so much is because that's where you have the majority of the Tejano population residing. But eventually, you're going to start to see the arrival of more and more Anglo-Texans into the region. And as they start to come, things start to change in terms of the industries there in southern Texas. You start to see the development of the commercial agriculture industry in the area, especially as you see the railroads developing there in Texas. There becomes more of a demand for agricultural products, and then they could be shipped to other areas because of the railroad, right? It's part of the effects of the railroad that'll take place throughout the Southwest. With the arrival of Anglo-Texans into the area, you also start to see companies, Anglo-Texan companies that are involved in irrigation, and so you'll see the development of irrigation systems taking place there in southern Texas, which will contribute to the growth of the agricultural industry in that area. And so as the area starts to develop more and more, and Anglo-Texans start to dominate more and more of the industries there, you'll start to see towns developing around the railroad, and these are Anglo-Texan towns, right? Whereas there was a large Tejano population in southern Texas, now you have the railroad coming into the area, and more Anglo-American towns developing around the railroad line. And with the railroad, you also have the rise of property value in the area. So if you think about it, if Mexican Americans are being pushed off their land or intimidated through violence and leaving their lands, and then Anglo-Americans buy this land, and then the value of the land goes up, and so the land costs a lot of money, it makes it really difficult for Mexican Americans who lost their land to buy new property, because the real estate has increased in price so much. And part of this is because of the effects of the arrival of the railroad, right? Property value rises up, farmland is more and more expensive, and so Mexican Americans end up getting pushed more and more from land ownership. And so you'll start to see Mexican Americans getting involved more in farm work as the agriculture industry starts to develop in southern Texas. So if Mexican Americans lost their land, now they're working as farm workers instead of having their own farms, and in some cases they may even be working the land that they actually used to own. Right? And so really horrible conditions going on as major economic changes take place in southern Texas with the arrival of more and more Anglo-Americans in the railroad. Anglo-Texans will eventually attempt to disenfranchise Tejanos. Disenfranchise meaning they're trying to take away the right to vote from Tejanos. And so you'll see a lot of issues being brought up around the right to vote. You'll see voter fraud taking place in Texas, where in some cases migrants from Mexico will be brought in by the Democratic Party. Now, keep in mind, too, at this time, the Democratic Party is mainly the party of the South. There are Northern Democrats as well, but mostly you have the stronghold of the Democratic Party being in the South. You know, it was the Democratic Party who was in support of slavery for a long period of time. And so this is the Democratic Party that's trying to disenfranchise Tejanos. And they dominate Texas because, you know, Texas is a southern state. And so you'll see the Democratic Party and their political bosses who are leaders in the party, such as James B. Wells, bringing in Mexican migrants when it comes time to vote. Okay, why are they doing this? Because they can control the votes of these Mexican migrants. All right, so say there's an election coming up, they bring in a bunch of Mexican migrants, have them vote the way that they want them to vote, and then candidates from the Democratic Party can win those elections, and they could gain political power in Texas, and then they could pass laws and do whatever they want. And so this is a tactic, right? Voter fraud by the Democratic Party. Another way of keeping Tejanos from voting is a poll tax that was eventually passed in Texas. What is a poll tax? Basically, it's a price that you have to pay in order to vote, right? So you're going to go to the polls to vote. You got to pay $1.75. And remember, $1.75 is a lot of money at this time for some individuals, especially if you're working as a farm worker at this time, right? So you got to pay $1.75, and so that's going to discourage a lot of Tejanos from even taking part in the voting process. On top of that, the Democratic Party, which is in control in Texas, is going to exclude Tejanos from even being members of the Democratic Party. So they can't take part in the primaries, right, where candidates are going to be voted for. And so really, Tejanos are being excluded from a major part of the whole voting process and the political process. Okay. Eventually, the case of Ricardo Rodriguez is going to bring up whether Tejanos have the right to vote or not, right? This is a court case that's going to deal with the issue of naturalization and whether Mexican Americans are actually citizens of the United States. That's what it's about. So the Rodriguez case will go to the courts, and Rodriguez was a Mexican migrant, and it was being debated whether he had the rights to vote or not, right? Whether he was a naturalized citizen or not. And so this brings into question the issue of are Mexican Americans naturalized citizens of the United States or not. 1872, there was a law passed by the federal government that stated only whites and African Americans had the right to vote. So what about Mexicans, right? It leaves them out. And so the Rodriguez case is very important because it's going to settle this issue. So if you remember, the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, it basically made Mexican American citizens of the United States, right? If Mexican Americans remained in the United States and they did not declare Mexican citizenship, then they were supposed to become U.S. citizens and have the right to vote, all the rights of a U.S. citizen, right? That was part of the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, and that was obviously being ignored in the United States at this time. And so when the Rodriguez case comes about, you're going to have defense attorneys of Rodriguez arguing that, hey, the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo is going to ensure that Rodriguez has citizenship and all Mexican Americans basically have citizenship, right? It's part of the treaty. The 14th Amendment also ensures the rights of Mexican Americans as naturalized citizens, right? They've gone through the process of naturalization and therefore they have the right to vote and all the rights of a U.S. citizen. So the Rodriguez case is very important because in court, basically, it's found that Mexican Americans are citizens. They do have the right to vote. So basically, Anglo-Texans did their best to keep Tejanos out of the voting process and the political process, but they failed. They were not able to disenfranchise Tejanos.